Shadows beneath the cross. The church of Maplewood stood tall against the morning sun, its stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the cobblestone street. Inside, a crowd had gathered, their voices rising in hymns that echoed through the high vaulted ceilings. At the altar stood Reverend Elijah, his commanding presence drawing all eyes as he raised his hands to bless the union of Sophia and Marcus. "May this marriage be fruitful," Elijah intoned, his voice deep and resonant. "May your love endure all trials, and may the Lord's light guide you both." The congregation erupted in applause as the couple kissed. Sophia's cheeks were flushed with joy, and Marcus's smile stretched wide. But as the couple turned to walk down the aisle, Elijah's gaze lingered on them, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. It had been 6 months since Sophia and Marcus's wedding. What had started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Sophia sat alone in their dimly lit living room, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. On the screen was a photo of Marcus in the arms of another woman, the timestamp from just 2 nights ago. Her heart raced as tears blurred her vision. She had confronted him earlier that day, and his reaction was nothing short of explosive. "How dare you accuse me of this nonsense?" Marcus had roared, his face contorted with fury. "You're paranoid, Sophia, always looking for something to fight about." But Sophia knew what she saw. The man she had loved with all her heart had become a stranger, his once gentle demeanor replaced with anger and secrecy. She felt her world crumbling beneath her. Across town, another couple, Clara and Benjamin, were locked in a bitter argument. Their once harmonious relationship had turned sour, with Benjamin spending nights away from home and Clara spiraling into despair. The pattern was the same with Lila and Damien, who had married only 3 months ago. Damien had grown cold, refusing to speak to Lila, his eyes haunted by an unknown torment. Anne, Clara's older sister, arrived at her apartment late one evening to find Clara sobbing on the kitchen floor. Broken dishes lay scattered around her. "Clara!" Anne cried, rushing to her side. "What happened?" "I can't do this anymore," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Benjamin hates me. I feel like I'm cursed." Anne helped her to her feet, her mind racing. This wasn't the Clara she knew, the vibrant, strong woman who had once lit up every room she entered. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Anne stayed with her sister that night, unable to sleep. As she stared at the ceiling, fragments of conversations came back to her. Sophia, her childhood friend, had mentioned her struggles with Marcus. Lila, her co-worker, had confided in her about Damien's sudden coldness. A nagging thought took root in Anne's mind. What if it wasn't just a coincidence? Anne began her investigation the next morning. She started by visiting Elder Naomi, an old family friend who had been a member of the church council for decades. Naomi had been quiet in recent years, retreating into solitude after a mysterious falling out with Reverend Elijah. "Naomi?" Anne said hesitantly, sitting across from the frail woman in her small, cluttered living room. "Do you remember the couples Reverend Elijah has married in the last few years?" Naomi's eyes darkened, her bony fingers tightening around her teacup. "Why do you ask, child?" "Something's wrong," Anne said, her voice trembling. "Every couple I've spoken to, Sophia, Clara, Lila, they're all falling apart. Their marriages are cursed." Naomi let out a heavy sigh, setting her teacup down with a clatter. "I warned them. I warned everyone, but no one would listen." "Warned them about what?" Anne pressed, leaning forward. Naomi hesitated before speaking. "Reverend Elijah is not the man he pretends to be. Years ago, I discovered his practices, dark rituals conducted late at night, offerings made in secret. He made a pact, Anne, a pact with forces that thrive on the destruction of love. Anne's blood ran cold. Are you saying he's a ritualist? Naomi nodded, her expression grave. He traded the unity of every marriage he blesses for his own power and influence. I tried to expose him, but he silenced me. They called me mad, and I was cast out. Armed with Naomi's warning, Anne began digging deeper. She visited the church late one evening, waiting in the shadows as the last of the congregation trickled out. She saw Reverend Elijah lock the doors and slip away into the night. Following at a safe distance, Anne trailed him to an isolated cabin deep in the woods. The air grew colder as she approached, her flashlight flickering as if reluctant to penetrate the darkness. Through a crack in the cabin's door, Anne saw Elijah kneeling before a grotesque altar, muttering incantations in a language she didn't understand. On the altar lay several objects, wedding rings, photographs of couples, and a blood-stained book. Anne's stomach churned as she realized the photographs were of couples Elijah had married. The shadows in the cabin seemed to move, slithering along the walls. Anne's heart pounded as she fumbled to take a photo with her phone. Suddenly, Elijah's voice grew louder, and the shadows coalesced into a figure, a towering, faceless entity that seemed to feed on the energy around it. Anne fled, her footsteps echoing in the silent woods. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she started the engine. Anne returned to the village, determined to expose Elijah. She shared her findings with the couples, showing them the photographs and describing what she had seen. Reactions were mixed. Some were horrified and ready to confront Elijah, while others were skeptical, unwilling to believe that their beloved pastor could be involved in such darkness. Tension grew in the community as whispers spread about Anne's accusations. Elijah, sensing the unrest, used his charisma to discredit her, painting her as a troublemaker intent on tearing the church apart. But Anne refused to back down. She enlisted the help of Father Patrick, a visiting priest known for his work in combating spiritual warfare. Together, they planned to confront Elijah during the church's annual marriage renewal ceremony, a gathering that would bring the entire community together. The day of the annual marriage renewal ceremony arrived with a strange stillness hanging over Maplewood. Anne stood in her small apartment, her hands trembling as she went over her notes for the 100th time. The photographs she'd taken at the cabin, her conversations with Elder Naomi, and the testimonies of the affected couples painted a chilling picture. Yet, fear gnawed at her resolve. She wasn't sure if the community would believe her, or if Elijah's influence was too strong to break. Across town, Father Patrick knelt in prayer. His Bible lay open before him, and his lips moved silently as he called upon divine protection. Though he had faced darkness before, something about Elijah's case felt heavier, more insidious. At the church, Reverend Elijah stood in his office, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror. His sharp suit and polished shoes reflected the image of the respected leader he portrayed to the world. But deep in his chest, a hollow ache reminded him of the price he had paid for his power. As he prepared to step out into the ceremony, a shadow moved behind him. The faceless entity he had summoned so many times spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "They know," it hissed. "You will silence them, or I will take what is mine." Elijah clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had to act quickly. The church was packed to capacity. Couples, families, and curious townsfolk filled the pews. the air buzzing with anticipation. The stained glass windows cast multicolored rays across the room, creating an almost ethereal glow. Elijah stood at the altar, smiling warmly as he greeted the crowd. Anne sat near the back, her heart pounding. She glanced at Father Patrick, who gave her a reassuring nod. Elder Naomi sat on her other side, clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. The ceremony began with hymns and prayers. Elijah's booming voice filled the church, his words flowing like honey. He called the couples forward, asking them to renew their vows. As he raised his hands to bless them, Anne stood abruptly. "Stop this!" she shouted, her voice ringing out over the congregation. Gasps filled the air as all eyes turned to her. Elijah froze, his hand still raised. "This man is not who you think he is," Anne continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He has cursed every marriage he's ever blessed. He's made a pact with dark forces, and I can prove it." Elijah's smile faltered, replaced by a cold glare. "Anne," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "This is neither the time nor place for your baseless accusations." Father Patrick stood, holding up a hand. "Let her speak," he said, his voice commanding. Anne stepped forward, pulling out her phone. She displayed the photographs she had taken at the cabin, the altar, the rings, the blood-stained book. Murmurs rippled through the congregation as she described what she had seen. "Elijah has been feeding on your marriages, your love," Anne said, her voice rising. "He traded your happiness for his power." Elijah's calm demeanor cracked, his face twisted in anger as the lights in the church flickered. The air grew heavy, and a cold wind swept through the room. "You dare challenge me in my house?" Elijah roared, his voice no longer human. Father Patrick stepped forward, holding up a crucifix. "This is not your house, Elijah. It is God's, and he will cast you out." The church descended into chaos as a deep guttural growl echoed through the walls. The faceless entity that Anne had seen in the cabin materialized behind Elijah, its form towering and shadowy. Gasps and screams erupted from the congregation as people scrambled to leave. The entity spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers. "You have failed me, Elijah. Now you will pay." Elijah fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His body convulsed as the entity began to consume him, its dark tendrils wrapping around him like chains. Father Patrick raised his crucifix, shouting prayers in Latin. The entity shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. Elder Naomi joined in the prayers, her voice strong and unwavering. Slowly, the darkness began to recede. Elijah let out a final, anguished scream as the entity dissolved into nothingness. He collapsed to the floor, his body frail and broken. Silence fell over the church as the remaining congregation stared at the scene in shock. Elijah's once imposing figure now lay crumpled and weak, his eyes wide with terror. I just wanted to help them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Father Patrick knelt beside him. "You let your pride and desperation lead you down a dark path. But God's mercy is infinite, Elijah. Will you repent?" Tears streamed down Elijah's face as he nodded. "I repent," he whispered. The congregation slowly returned to their seats, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and relief. Anne stood at the altar, her legs trembling. She had done it, she had exposed the truth. In the days that followed, the church underwent a spiritual cleansing. Father Patrick led the community in prayers of healing and forgiveness. The couples who had been affected began to rebuild their lives, though the scars of Elijah's betrayal remained. Anne published her story, warning others about the dangers of blind faith and unchecked power. Elder Naomi, once ostracized, was welcomed back into the community as a spiritual leader. As for Elijah, he disappeared shortly after his confession. Some said he had gone into exile to atone for his sins. Others believed the darkness had finally claimed him. Years later, the Church of Maplewood stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. The community had learned to rely on one another, their bonds stronger than ever. Anne often visited Elder Naomi, who had become a mentor to her. Together, they worked to educate others about spiritual discernment and the importance of questioning even the most revered leaders. Though the shadows of the past lingered, the people of Maplewood moved forward, their faith unshaken but wiser for the trials they had faced. And in a forgotten corner of the woods, the cabin where Elijah's dark deeds had unfolded lay abandoned, its secrets buried but never forgotten. And so, the shadows that loomed over Maplewood were lifted, but not without leaving their scars. Reverend Elijah's choices brought unimaginable pain to many, yet his story serves as a stark reminder. Trust must be earned, not blindly given. The power of truth, faith, and unity prevailed, but at a heavy cost. What lies in the heart of a man can be a mystery, even to himself. Sometimes, those who claim to bring light may, in fact, carry darkness. To the people of Maplewood, this chapter of betrayal and redemption became a testament to resilience. They learned to question, to stand together, and to fight for what's right. The light will always conquer the shadows, but only if we have the courage to face the darkness. Remember, not everyone who wears the cloth is truly of the light. Stay vigilant, stay united. If you enjoyed this story or found it thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Anne's shoes? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.